you all to the City Talks lectures. This is the second lecture in the Fall 2017 series of the City Talks. The theme of this semester's City Talks is the political life of urban streetscapes. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ruben Rose Redwood, and I'm a professor in the geography department at UVic, and I'm also the chair of the UVic Committee for Urban Studies, which organizes the City Talks. Now, I'd like to begin by first acknowledging that this event is taking place on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, and we're grateful to be here tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the financial support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, as well as UVic's EU Center of Excellence and various departments, programs, and faculties at UVic, which have supported the City Talks this year. Now, it's really truly my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Anton Tantner, who is currently a lecturer at the university in the Department of History at the University of Vienna. His research examines the history of house numbering as a political technology of urban government, early modern precursors of the search engine, and societies of control. His habilitation thesis, if I'm not mistaken, is on intelligence offices in early modern Europe, which received the Viennese Award for Urban History. And he has also published various works on the history of house numbering in European cities, including his recently published book, House Numbers, Pictures of a Forgotten History, that was published in 2015. Now, I first came into contact with Anton a decade ago as we were both conducting research on the history of house numbering, which, as you might expect, there are quite few scholars in the world that are studying this topic. Which is actually, as you'll see tonight, quite interesting, in fact. And in 2012, Anton and I guest edited a special issue of the journal Urban History on this theme. We did all of this virtually via email without ever having talked on the phone, Skyped, or met face-to-face. So it's only this week that he's come all the way from Austria that we finally meet face-to-face. So it's tonight. Anton will be speaking on. He'll be giving a presentation on his work in a talk entitled "The Political Life of Numbers: The History of House Numbering in European Cities." So let's welcome Anton Tantner to the City Talks.
So thank you very much, Ruben, for this introduction, and also thank you very much for inviting me and so having the possibility the first time to meet each other, as you have said, face to face, because that is really perhaps something to be done also in the future to bring together the community of house number scholars and perhaps to continue our research. I want to start by taking you back to 18th century Paris. In the year 1779, something spectacular is happening in this city at the Seine in Paris. Houses in the French capital are being systematically numbered for the first time, and what is more, this initiative did not originate with a government agency, but a private citizen. Marin Krenfeld de Storks, editor of the Almanach de Paris, wants to increase the efficiency of his address book, and to do that, he needed numbered addresses. Tolerated by the police, members of his staff start, mostly at night, to paint numbers above or next to each door. Numbers are assigned by the street. The first house on one side of the street becomes number 1. Numbers continue to the end of the street in ascending order. Then doors of the other side of the street are numbered, until the lowest and the highest number in the street face each other. Parisians eye Krenfeld de Storks' activities with suspicion. Louis-Sébastien Mercier, the famous chronicler of urban Parisian life, also takes note of them. But in 1782, he has to report in his Tableau de Paris that the eminently useful enterprise of numbering the houses had been stopped. As to the reasons, he can only speculate. Perhaps the grand mansions did not want to have numbers written on them, since where would it lead if a townhouse of an honorable councillor, collector general, or His Eminence the Bishop were to be subjected to a common run-of-the-mill number? What good would then be all that grand marble? Everyone wants to be a Caesar. No one wants to be second in Rome. After all, it may even happen that the palace of a nobleman would receive a lower number than a commoner's workshop, that would look suspiciously like a pinch of equality, and against that one has to be on guard. So my talk is about something that is thought to be a footnote to history, the house number. This device has become so commonplace that it never even occurs to people that it could have a history. But just like many other commonplace things which seem always to have existed, the everyday house number was once upon a time an invention, something that had to be introduced into people's day-to-day lives. This was by no means a simple process, meeting, as it did, with a lot of opposition and difficulty. The house number saw its greatest moment of triumph in the period of so-called absolutism, in what is called the Age of Enlightenment. The example of Paris I just mentioned is a bit misleading, because in most of the cases, house numbers in the 18th century were not introduced so that people living and working in towns and villages could find their way around more easily. Nor was it intended to be particularly helpful to travelers. Instead, it started life in that grey area between the military, the tax authorities, and early modern policing. It arose out of a dust of events, as Michel Foucault calls it, but until recently has rarely appeared in history books. Yes, I have prepared a handout, so maybe we can pass it on. This handout gives you information about a gallery of house numbers that I have opened up 15 years ago on the internet. And you will find there pictures of more than 100 historical house numbers of all over Europe. And this gallery exists also in an English version and can be found under this address, housenumbers.tantner, my name.net. And please don't be surprised at the old-fashioned design. It dates back to the year 2002, and I did not change it since then. Yes, all the information and also about the book Ruben has mentioned you find on this handout. Numbering houses is a way of designating an address. A house number allocates each house its own unique position and enables the state to know about the citizens who live there. For those living in the house and the neighbors, the walls simply surrounded an open house, as historians of early modern Europe have called it. For the purposes of a state, on the other hand, these walls were obstacles that got in the way. So long as there wasn't any official system of designating an address, the house stood like a monolith that concealed its wealth and belongings within itself, at least from the point of the official government. This made it difficult for the tax and military authorities, which lacked precise local knowledge, to keep tabs on them. But how about the dark times before the introduction of house numbers? How could authorities or common people find someone when there were no numbers fixed on the house's walls? The meager evidence relating to house addresses in ancient times suggests that, there they existed, they were based on the owner's name. In Roman towns, the inscriptions on slaves' collars, indicating where a possible runaway slave was to be returned to, sometimes gave the name of a building, but often the owner's name and a rough indication of an area in the city of Rome were sufficient for the return of a slave to the right address. Until the late medieval period, there was no great need to give the exact address of houses. In societies where most relations were based on personal acquaintanceship, a person's name and the approximate indication of a place were all that was thought necessary to find them. In Marseille, as late as the 14th century, creditors only noted down the rudimentary addresses, for example the street names, of those who owed them debts, that being all that was required to get hold of them if need be. Before the introduction of house numbers, the name of a house, which was often different to that of the owner, was a usual way of identifying the house. However, with a growth of central control on the part of the authorities and the associated requirement of state officials to know all about the belongings within individual houses, the disadvantages of addresses based on the names of houses became apparent. The name was, after all, not always visible, since not every house displayed a sign. Knowledge of an address in a locality was limited to the neighborhood and the local lord. State officials were therefore dependent on local knowledge. They had to rely on the aid of the local lord's officials, whose interests were likely to be conflicted. But even when house names were visible and listed on a register, addresses based on them were problematic. There was a limit to people's inventiveness at naming houses. The result was a lot of similar sounding house names that could be confused. In Vienna, at the end of the 18th century, there were 6 houses in the city center with the name the Golden Eagle, and a further 23 in the suburbs. In other words, there were 29 houses that could be confused with one another if the house name alone was given. In addition, house names were not fixed, but altered with a change of ownership. The renaming of a house was a display of power and a symbol of occupation by new owners. A house number issued by the state, on the other hand, had the advantage of creating discrete, clearly distinguishable and fixed units. Once it was nailed on the wall of a house, on a sign, or painted on and left to dry, it was linked as ineradicably as possible to the house. It enabled recruiting officers, tax collectors, and court officials to know all about what was inside. In effect, it made the walls transparent. It enabled, as James C. Scott has called it, seeing like a state. Now, I want to take you on a journey, or perhaps a gallop, through Europe, focusing mainly on the 18th century. Actually, it is not so trivial to trace the origins of house numbers. Once they had been introduced and had become accepted, taken for granted in fact, these origins became lost in the mists of time. What is certain is that, as I have already mentioned, this whole project of numbering houses can be seen as typical of the 18th century. Without any trace of irony, the house number can be considered one of the most important innovations of the Age of Enlightenment, of that century obsessed as it was with order and classification. A chronicle of the numbering of houses could begin with the numbering of the houses in the Jewish quarter of Prague in 1727. In the process of what was called the conscription of Jews, a registration of Jews, not just the houses, but the individual units of habitation within the houses were numbered floor by floor. It would be equally possible to begin with a numbering of the houses in the Paris suburbs in 1724 to 1728, which was carried out in relation to a household census. In the latter case, the numbers were carved into the doorposts, and some of these numbers even exist today. It is true that these carved numbers were then used for giving addresses, but the actual purpose was not the identification of the houses, but the establishment of their number, a total that was not to be added to by putting up new buildings. This numbering of houses was therefore principally a way to restrict the growth of the city. aiding in the search for a house was only a secondary reason. One could also mention that according to Edward Hatton's A New View of London of 1708, the houses of Prescott Street in London were numbered, even if these numbers were not actually used for a few decades. In the search for the first appearance of a system of addressing, one might also include ideas about an urban utopia imagined during the early modern period. For example, in a posthumous volume by the 17th century architecture theorist Nikolaus Goldmann, which outlines an ideal city, he proposes that, quote, in every house a number of the door shall be set out in such a manner that one might inquire upon the houses according to their numbers. The number shall be furnished with a place upon which the number of the master of the name of the master of the house might be set out in large letters. End of quote. These were individual cases of numbered houses. There were even individual cases of numbered houses, even in the preceding centuries, however. For example, as early as in the year 1519, the buildings of a Fuggerei, founded by the Fugger family of financiers in Augsburg, German city, that was a social housing complex that still exists with Fuggerei. So these houses were said to have been numbered using Gothic numerals. It is a very early occurrence of a system of addressing, if, that is, the numbers were actually used for the identification of the houses. Anyone finally wanting to go further back in search of an origin can point to the 68 houses situated on the Pont Notre Dame in Paris. These have been consecutively numbered since the 15th century, and from as late as the 16th century have borne gold numerals on a red background. Jean Bronteau, the historian of Paris house numbers, thinks it wrong to see this numbering as a precursor of later house numbering, even though the numbers were actually used for the identification of the houses in the records. The purpose of the numbering was not so much to provide the houses with an address, as it was to keep a tally of the city's wealth. So, looking for the inventor of the house number is probably a pointless occupation. Karl Marx's statement that, quote, a critical history of technology would show how little any of the inventions of the 18th century are the work of a single individual, end of quote, would seem to be relevant here. It was most likely a collective invention introduced at various times in various places. It was perhaps Prussia that saw the real start of a rage for numbering houses. In 1737, a directive was issued that on the day before the military enters small towns, numbers are to be posted on the houses. The numbers thus making it easier to provide billets for the army. House numbers became general all over Europe from the middle of the 18th century. It was a period in which those in the service of the police, such as a certain Jacques-François Quixote, went so far as to propose the numbering of houses for the purpose of surveillance of a population in their nightmare vision of control. I refer here to a kind of utopia of this Mr. Quixote, which is also really illustrated by very fascinating pictures, as you can see here. So he wanted to keep hold or to keep a register of the total of Paris population, and so in this proposition, he also wanted to number all the houses, what you can see here in this picture. But now let's continue with this gallop through Europe. In 1750, the houses of Madrid were provided with numbers, and in the process, a system of numbering houses by block came into use. The numbers seem to have caught on in Madrid. A British traveller visiting Madrid in the 1770s confirmed that all the houses had numbers. A few years after Madrid, it was the turn of Trieste, where in 1754 the houses were numbered in connection with a census. In the same year, the introduction of house numbering was discussed in Vienna, but in the end was not carried out. There was an attempt to sell the new method of control to a skeptical population by the argument that thereby, quote, rascally and dangerous folk could be more easily traced. But then the authorities prevaricated, possibly out of fear of too much opposition. In London directives to number the houses date from 1762 and 1765. In 1767, numbering was carried out in the Tyrol, with numbers painted on the houses in red. In the Habsburg province of Further Austria, numbering was also decreed in this year of 1767. French provincial towns were given house numbers in 1768 to make it easier to provide billets for the military. Paris was not affected, since barracks already existed there, and only in the new streets around about Les Halles were the houses given numbers. In 1770, house numbering was decreed in the Bohemian and Austrian lands of the Habsburg monarchy in preparation for a new recruitment system that attributed numbers, therefore, were called conscription numbers. In the same year in Munich, the painter Franz Gaulrath was given the task of supplying a set of numbers for each of the 4 districts of a city. A police initiative directed at beggars and vagrants, with the numbers painted in white on the house doors. Geneva was provided with numbers in 1782. Austria-ruled Milan received them in 1786. Meanwhile, in 1787, the author of Les Liaisons Dangereuses, Pierre Chaudalot de Laclos, sent a proposal to the Journal de Paris on how one could number the streets of Paris, but he had no success. By that time, the private house numbering project of Krenfeld de Storks had already been stopped. After the revolution, however, a new system of house numbering was introduced into Paris and other French cities in connection with the levying of a land tax in 1790. It was not based this time on streets, but on districts of a city. As a system of addressing, it was a retrograde step compared with Krenfeld's method of numbering the houses by streets. The 48 city districts introduced shortly before in Paris, they were called sections, they were given numbers starting from 1. The numbers covered the city in a completely haphazard fashion, not unlike places under the Habsburg monarchy, and there were streets on which the houses were painted several times with the same number as they crossed over into different sections. The French Revolution was important on a European scale as regards house numbers. The Revolutionary Wars bringing house numbering to many towns in Germany, Switzerland and the Netherlands. Mention can be made here of examples such as Aachen in 1794 and Nuremberg in 1796. There's a well-known anecdote from Cologne explaining the name of the Eau de Cologne firm 4711, according to which, during the French occupation, what was to become the building of the perfume manufacturer Mühlen was given the number 4711. Numbering had actually been decided upon in Cologne a few days before the French troops marched in. The French then proceeded to put it into practice with a vengeance. In Berlin, house numbering was to be suggested relatively late. In 1798, the police chief Johann Philipp Eisenberg proposed giving the whole city a series of numbers in which the numerals would run continuously in sequence along the houses on the observer's right-hand side. The King of Prussia rejected this method, ordering in 1799 that the numbering should take place street by street. That is what in fact happened. The numbering started on the right-hand side of a busier or more important part of the street, continuing on the same side up to the end of the street and then running back on the left-hand side. Finally, in Venice, during the first period of Habsburg rule, that was during 1797 and 1805, the houses were numbered according to districts or sestiere. The relevant directive, dated 24 September of 1801, ordered that the numbers were to be fixed using black paint made of bone charcoal and oil onto a white painted rectangle already placed on the house. At the same time, the street names were written up on the houses, and the new land registry of the city districts of Venice was to be set up. So, to summarize this incomplete list, the reasons for the introduction of house numbering in the 18th century are probably numerous. They were intended to aid either in billeting the military or recruiting soldiers, or else they were introduced to improve the administration of payment and taxes, or fire insurance, or to reduce the number of beggars. The case of Paris, where the numbers of 1779 onwards should facilitate the use of an address book, is an exception for Europe, in contrast to the USA, where, as Ruben has shown in his work, house numbers most often were introduced for commercial purposes, to facilitate to find the houses in address directories. Concerning the European case, it is not surprising that what started as a system for military and taxation purposes should give rise to widespread suspicion about this cultural technique. The reaction of people not used to house numbers may be one of horror, as you can see, for example, from the memoirs of a certain Swiss named Ludwig Meyer from Knonau. Traveling in 1789 to the University of Halle with a friend, he reported, quote, "When we arrived on Austrian soil, we were horrified to see numbers on the houses, which appeared to us as a symbol of the hand of a ruler determinedly taking possession of a private individual." End of quote. As a consequence, the numbering of houses has brought about opposition in many places. The common folk regarded the new numbers as symbols of a state and sometimes opposed them. In Litomyśl in Bohemia, now the Czech Republic, on the night of December the 3rd to December the 4th of 1770, it was alleged that the numbers just put up on the walls of 14 houses were partly befouled with dung, partly gouged out using an iron bar. So the quote in the certain files. This was a violent reaction. What is a house for, after all, if not to protect people from the world by being separate from it? A house is like an extra layer of skin for people, a sort of collective clothing. The dictionary definition of a house is, in general, a place of shelter and safety. A number fixed to a house positively threatens to rob it of this role of protection. It is a means of getting hold of those men within the house who are capable of military service and recruiting them into the army. A number makes the house visible in the registers of the military authorities, and gouging out the number is an attempt to erase the visibility of the house. Mutilating the house as an extension of the skin could be compared to the acts of self-mutilation carried out by young men of military age trying to avoid military service, cutting off their thumbs and pulling out their teeth in order to make themselves unfit for it. Violence against one's own body, violence against a house. Such acts of self-aggression seem to be all that was left in face of the power of addressing wielded by the state. Scandalous behavior similar to what took place at Litomyśl was reported by the district captain in Jihlava on Wednesday, April 29th of 1771. Census taking and house numbering got underway in this town of Jihlava, that was the main town of a royal district in Moravia. Already on the night of April the 30th, however, it transpired that a number of unknown miscreants threw detritus at the wall of a Capuchin monastery designated with the number 1, rendering the same totally unrecognizable. The district captain reacted immediately, summoning by beating of the drum the citizens of Jihlava to assemble and calling upon them to yield up the scoundrels. Anyone divulging the names of the culprits was to be given anonymity, their name concealed, and in addition given a reward to the sum of 10 imperial talers. The district captain did not neglect to declare his readiness to carry out the most severe threat against this dastardly offense in the event of a discovery of the delinquents. He recommended that the Moravian governing authorities publicly announce an additional punishment for such scoundrels. The authorities called upon announced that this is the first and only case arising to this state in the course of the entire registration in the country that the inhabitants have responded to the munificent high-mindedness of the princely authority with such criminal acts and disobedience, the like of which has not been seen in all the other districts in the land. There was nothing else to be done. Should the person or persons responsible be apprehended, they should be handed over to the resident hanging judges for trial. But according to the surviving documents, nothing of the sort happened. The call for divulging the names of the scoundrels went unheeded and the criminal act unpunished. Elsewhere, in so-called Further Austria, a Habsburg province, we know the name of someone who forcibly removed a house number. In October 1768, in the village of Beuren near Ulm, belonging to a monastery of Buxheim, a local barber surgeon, Johann Georg Wautier, set about numbering the houses in series. He met with opposition, however, when he came to the house of a cabinet maker named Johann Meyerhofer. His wife, Franziska Jelen, shouted to him that her husband had ordered that when a surgeon came, he should be told not to place a numeral on his house. Wautier nevertheless proceeded to put the number up. When the house numberer went to the inn that evening, he was called a rascal by the cabinet maker, who also happened to be there. Thereupon Wautier boxed his ears. This resulted in fisticuffs, in the course of which Wautier was bitten in the finger and received a foot injury. Into the bargain, Meyerhofer removed the number from his house. A little later, however, the delinquent seems to have regretted his behavior, claiming he had been drunk. He requested that the surgeon put back the number. The surgeon told the court official that he forgave Meyerhofer everything. It is not known whether there were any further consequences for the man who had put up the numbers without so much as a by your leave. One thing is certain: the cabinet maker achieved renown in the world of drama, becoming the subject of the play Johann Meyerhofer, or The Introduction of House Numbers, a comedy of peasant life, a drama that was written by the author Manfred Eichhorn in the year 1994. There was also opposition to house numbering being introduced in Geneva. After two painters there had painted the numbers allocated according to the district of the city, on the night of 21st to 22nd of October 1782, as many as 150 numbers were removed in spite of nightly patrols by the military. A suspect named as Françoise Jouard said at her trial that she had regarded the number as something resembling the Inquisition. Even decades after the introduction of house numbers, they were a cause of skepticism. The philosopher Walter Benjamin, for one, in his study of Paris in the 19th century, recognized their power, describing the house number as an, as he called it, extensive network of controls that since the French Revolution had been bringing bourgeois life ever more tightly into its meshes. Walter Benjamin knew that the extension of control had not taken place without opposition. In the second half of the 19th century, the proletarian inhabitants of Saint-Antoine area in Paris still resisted using, as Benjamin calls it, the cold official number when giving their addresses, instead preferring to refer to their houses by name. Even in the 21st century, it happens that new systems of addressing meet with considerable opposition. I rely, therefore, on the work of Ruben. Maybe he has already presented his findings to you. I just want to recall it. In the rural areas of the US state of West Virginia, until 2001, normally only the letterboxes were numbered. We were situated at some distance from their houses on the side of the highway, giving no indication of the location. The house numbering system newly instituted that year was justified on the grounds of security and was called the 911 addressing system, reflecting the emergency number 911. Unfortunately, many property owners were not particularly over the moon about being given a new number. Some of them went beyond shouting about it and threatened the people doing the numbering with rivers and machetes. One member of the addressing and mapping board responsible for numbering the houses came out with a macho comment, "Addressing isn't for sissies." The cause of his trouble was that being given a new number was seen as an infringement of folks' property and an attack on their identity. One particularly incensed homeowner living in Marion County, Ida Starks, wrote to a letters column in 2007 decrying the introduction of the house numbers as evidence of a communist takeover. Quotation: "What about our history? This house number means something to me and my family. It means stability, history of both family and community. It means that my work through the years has established my family. Have we become so communist that ownership means nothing? What will they dictate to us next?" So Mrs. Ida Stark. So do house numbers mean the dawning of a world of freedom and equality? Well, in past centuries, there were people who argued along those lines, as the Paris example I mentioned at the beginning proves, just this quotation, pinch of equality from Mercier. It was not just ordinary people who opposed house numbers in the 18th century. The nobility also sometimes rose up in arms. Some were not at all in favor of their castles being subjected to numbering, like the humble dwellings of hoi polloi. From their point of view, numbering houses was a downright egalitarian act, since all houses were equal before the law of the house number, be they palaces or cottages, stately homes or hovels. Take the example of Hungary in 1786. In the letter, Habsburg Emperor Joseph II was at first confident that the Hungarian nobility would not be opposed to the introduction of a new recruitment system and the numbering of houses. Quote, "It goes without saying that all the honorable lords, nobles and magnates, wherever they may be, should not be fearful of being recorded along with the families and the castles being numbered, just as the royal castle is." In the edict issued by the Royal Chancellery of Bratislava, or then Pressburg, this argument was again employed. Nobles and magnates would have nothing to object to in the numbering, quote, "since the royal and imperial palace itself, inhabited by His Majesty, is similarly numbered." But it turned out differently, however. The ranks of nobles openly objected to the census, the so-called conscription, and its commissioners. Some of the officials were beaten off from villages. One officer was murdered in the county of Veszprém, and another was sprayed with water and made to promise never to set foot in the district again. The situation actually was different in Transylvania, where it led to an uprising of the Vlachs, the Romanian peasants. They expected too much from registration and house numbering, namely the end of oppression by the local lords. They were thinking that registration was synonymous with recruitment to the military, and that therefore it meant the end of the hated service to the landlords. Those in the uprising were convinced that they were behaving in accordance with Emperor Joseph II's wishes, but they were put down. Concerning Hungary, the task of the conscription and the numbering of houses seemed to have been successfully introduced by 1786, but the ranks of nobles were to win in the end. In particular, the high demands for recruitment during the war against the Ottoman Empire in 1788 led to the increased opposition. Joseph II had to suspend the new system of recruitment in January 1788. House numbers were taken down from houses against the background of military music being played and cannons being fired. So that was the situation in Hungary. So I've told you now a lot of resistance towards house numbering, but nevertheless it is important to stress that this new technique was often accepted by the population, who appropriated the house numbers and used them for their own purposes. One can find evidence of this in newspaper ads. In the case of Vienna, one of them published in the Wiener Diarium, the Journal of Vienna, on February the 2nd of 1771, announced that just some days ago, quote, a Bolognese puppy, a male white all over and having blue eyes, but with one eye lighter blue than the other, and a small muzzle and a black nose, weighing 7 pounds, had gone missing. Anyone finding or identifying it should come to number 222 Bogner Lane up to the 2nd floor and is sure of gaining a good reward. With therefore an announcement of a missing dog using a house number to identify the house to which the dog should be returned. And in fact, if you look at the city map of Vienna, produced by Joseph Anton Tantner, that was the first city plan of Vienna to have the house numbers recorded on it, you will find the house in Bognergasse, Bogner Lane. You see the circle. Another example of the acceptance of house numbers can be found in letters, which give precise addresses. Take, for example, the letters of Mozart. In 1781, after being in Vienna for several months, the composer was accustomed to giving the house number, so that his correspondents could use it to reply to him. In the case of his first 2 residences, he did not mention a house number, but as early as September 1781, we are told that his new room was situated at number 1175, the Graben, on the 3rd floor. Mozart was a restless being, living at no fewer than 12 addresses during his 10 years in Vienna. His last residence was number 970, Rauhensteingasse, in the Emperor's house, 1st floor. So, house numbers should guarantee order and stability. But in some cases, we had one big enemy, time. This was especially true in case of the Habsburg monarchy and its capital, Vienna, where the system being used to number the houses was the consecutive numbering of all the houses of a village, starting with 1 and sometimes ending with a 4-digit number at the last house being registered. This system was, as I've said, introduced in 1770, and it caused many problems. Particularly in the capital of a monarchy in Vienna, houses were quite often demolished, put together and newly built, so that the original chain of numbers was broken and chaos emerged. In the following decades, the houses had to be renumbered for several times, up to 6 times in some districts, to re-establish the proper order that again and again was threatened. But also other systems of house numbering were endangered by chaos. Take the example of Berlin, where around 1800 the houses were numbered streetwise, using the so-called horseshoe system. And this system can also be tricky, as the writer Mark Twain was to find out when he first stopped in the capital of the Wilhelminian Empire on his tour of Europe in 1891. Mark Twain was enthusiastic about Berlin, regarding it not just as the most governed, but the best governed city in the world. Everything seemed to him to be well ordered. For example, the fire brigade and the horses and carriages. Only in one respect there was chaos, the numbering of the houses. Quotation Mark Twain. At first one thinks it was done by an idiot, but there's too much variety about it for that. An idiot could not think of so many different ways of making confusion and propagating blasphemy. The numbers run up one side of a street and down the other. That is endurable, but the rest isn't. We often use one number for 3 or 4 houses, and sometimes we put the number on only one of the houses and let you guess at the others. Sometimes we put a number on a house, 4 for instance, then put 4A, 4B, 4C on the succeeding houses, and one becomes old and decrepit before he finally arrives at 5. A result of this systemless system is that when you are at number 1 in a street, you haven't any idea how far it may be to number 150. It may be only 6 or 8 blocks. It may be a couple of miles. So that was Mark Twain. But the worst thing, however, for the author of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer was the fact that the house numbers were not in sequence but jumped. The number 50 or 60 being suddenly followed by 140 and then descending again. In short, it was a sort of insanity, making it difficult to find one's way about in Berlin. The system of numbering houses, street by street, was no guarantee that chaos and disorder would be held at bay. Madness and confusion emerged, the winners again and again from the eternal battle for order and control. Well, until now I have only spoken implicitly of house numbering. And now I want to introduce to you these methods more systematically, as human ingenuity has come up with a surprising variety of ways of numbering houses. Until now, I have differentiated 8 methods, but perhaps there are even more. Well, the first method would be numbering in sequence according to place. It could be also called a consecutive method. It was used, as I've already mentioned, in the Habsburg monarchy, starting with a house at the entrance to a village or with a seat of a nobility, for example, the imperial castle in Vienna or the castle in Rajani in Prague, where you can see until now the number 1 on the entrance gate. There was a sequence of numbers counting from 1. The last house numbered was given the highest numbers. And in towns, this could reach quite a large number, sometimes going into 4 figures. If one was in a hurry to find its location, it could only be identified by adding the street name. The second method was numbering in sequence according to district. For example, in towns like Mainz, Augsburg and Nuremberg, a letter was allocated to each district of the town, and the houses within the districts were numbered in a sequence. The letter of a district was often put up on the house in addition to the number. This was, for example, the case in Nuremberg in the year of 1796. That was after the French occupation to simplify the billeting of the military. And there were 2 districts in Nuremberg. One was called St. Siebert, one was called St. Lawrence. And the first district had the numbers S1 to S1000 and 1706. The second district had the numbers L1 to L1578. In Venice, maybe some of you have already been to this city, such a system without the allocation of a letter for each sestiere has been in use right up to the present. So it's something of a challenge to find a house in that city on the lagoon until now. The third method was the numbering according to block. This was less common than the 2 other methods mentioned so far. Here, a combination of numbers letters were allocated to a block of houses, and the houses of this block were given a series of numbers. See, for example, Madrid, where a separate number was allocated to every block of houses, And in Madrid, this block of houses was called Manzana. You can see it on the left, Manzana number 175. In this case, this is the block of houses with its number. And then inside, the houses of a block were numbered based on this. So to locate an address, it was therefore necessary to know the street name and the number of the block as well as the number of the house in the block. Another city where the system exists until now, the German city of Mannheim in its center, that is kind of a classical planned city with this rectangular system. And this system is still in use today. Every block of houses being allocated a letter and a number, for example A1 or U6. Here the houses of every block are numbered either clockwise or anti-clockwise, and the typical address being B25 or U73. Yes, or example as we can see here as 6, that's the address of the block, and the arrow shows that the houses in this block from 26 to 43 are to be found if you go left from this sign. So method number 4, the horseshoe numbering by street, that is also called the clockwise scheme. A sequence of numbers, always beginning with 1, is allocated to each street. This goes up one side of the street and back down the other, until the house with the highest number in the street is opposite the lowest. In Switzerland, we have also a really fascinating name for this system, where it is called the Bustrophédon numbering, that is numbering on alternate sides. This method was used by, as I've said, by Grainfelder Storks in Paris in 1779, and was taken up also in Berlin in 1800. The fifth system is also a streetwise system of numbering, the alternate or odd-even system, sometimes also called zigzag system. With this system, numbers are also allocated by street, but the houses on one side of a street are now only numbered using even numbers, and on the other side using odd numbers. As far as the community of house number scholars knows by now, thanks to Rubens' work, this method was first introduced in the USA, in Philadelphia in 1790. It was US Marshal Clement Biddle who numbered the houses using this method while carrying out the census. Shortly afterwards, he published an address book in which he described in detail how to locate any particular house. In the next few years, this odd-even system spread to many US cities. In New York, for example, it was introduced in 1793. There's evidence that the system was discussed for the first time in Europe in 1799. In the Journal de Paris, an engineer called Pierre Ascension Garot proposed this very method as a better alternative to numbering based on the sections of Paris. In the following years, there was a thoroughgoing debate over the pros and cons of the different systems and ways of establishing the numbers in Paris. In the end, a final decision was made in 1805 during the period of the office of a certain Nicolas Frochot. He was the prefect of the Département de la Seine. That same year, the odd-even system was introduced in Paris and became a model for the whole of Europe, although it took sometimes decades. In Vienna, for example, the people complained about the system of consecutive numbering all over the first half of the 19th century. The odd-even system was introduced only in 1862. And now in Berlin, where the clockwise system was in use, authorities tried to install the odd-even system starting in 1929. However, for economic reasons, complete renumbering of all the streets did not take place. So today in Berlin, there are still two numbering systems, which drives visitors crazy, just as did Mark Twain in the 19th century. On this map, see the horseshoe numbering system in red and the zigzag or odd-even system in blue. So, back to to the overview. Method number 6, the block decimal system. This was first used in Philadelphia. Here, after 1856, 100 numbers were dedicated to the houses of every block in a street. From the next intersection, the numbering started with the next 100, so that you get houses with 4 or 5 featured numbers. And this system was known as the Philadelphia system. Now, method number 7, the metric system, or also the distance scheme. And with this, the number given to a house is decided by the distance of the house from a defined 0 point. The numérotation métrique, worked out by the mathematician Auguste Savigny Leblanc as early as 1800, is used in many French localities. A similar system is also in place in Latin America, although I have to say I still have to learn more about how this really works, I think, in Argentina. And finally, the method number 8, the decametric system. This is a mixture of the alternate and the metric numbering methods, in which the numbers are decided, as in the last method, according to the distance from the starting point, but odd and even numbers are used on opposite sides. Designed by the architect Jean-Jacques Cuvier, it has been introduced in the last few decades, particularly in countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Now I come to a chapter with the title Worldwide Triumph. And yes, what you see here is this really fascinating number in Prague. There still exist many of these so-called conscription numbers that originally were introduced in the 18th century. So the places with house numbers, without house number, are getting rarer in these days, but they still exist. Tokyo is a well-known case, a city with no address, as Roland Barthes called it. It is true that there's a house numbering system there, based on a block in which a residence can be found, but it is not used to locate buildings. Instead of identifying the street name and the house number, the address in Tokyo is represented in the form of drawings, by hand or printed, giving the directions to a residence from a starting point, such as a railway station. If you're looking for a place and don't happen to have a drawing, you just go to the nearest police station, and there you are given the necessary information. But continent after continent has been taken over by numbers in the last decades. In the middle of the 1980s, a large-scale project of cooperation was launched between the World Bank and the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Between 1989 and 1994, the larger towns in 15 states in sub-Saharan Africa, including Benin, Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, Mozambique and Senegal, were given house numbers, generally using the decametric system. Reviewing the project, the town planners put a figure of approximately $200,000 on the cost of introducing a system of addresses for each of the larger towns, and emphasized that this measure could bring about, as we called it, slum upgrading. In around 2005, the German architect Michael Maywald was given the task by the Frankfurt Center for the International Migration and Development of introducing street names and house numbers in the 3 million strong metropolis of Addis Abeba. A newspaper article about this plan described how paying electricity bills had been achieved up until that time. Quote, "The Ethiopian telephone service, the water and electricity systems too are awaiting the introduction of addresses, so that then they will be able to send out their bills. Up until now, people have been coming with their cash once a month to a collection point. There they can pay their bills. Anyone not coming and paying has the water, telephone and power cut off." So the cost of allocating the house numbers, and in this case we were allocated by street according to the alternate site numbering system, was covered by the house owners and was around €5,138. Finally, in South Korea, the system of house numbering by block, introduced in 1918 by the Japanese colonial power, was replaced in 2014 by a system of alternate site numbering. In all, 160,000 street names and more than 5 million house numbers had been allocated. The triumphal march of house numbers therefore continues unabated right into the 21st century. In the age of air photography and geoinformation systems, there's no stopping the process by which every house is known to be to the daily eye of the authorities. But is it just the authorities? No such luck. Internet firms do have an interest in getting hold of your address and knowing your house number. In 2012, Google started to transcribe house numbers photographed by the Street View using their very own reCAPTCHA user dialogue system. People using Google were themselves therefore helping them to refine their products free of charge. It will be interesting to see how people handle this new situation and what strategies of appropriation and subversion they will employ. I want to end by showing the genus-faced countenance of this tiny technology of address by jumping into a recent history of Austria that maybe after the election 2 weeks ago will perhaps see a revival. It is often the case that social and political movements are opposed to any control or surveillance systems, and house numbers can be included within these. But sometimes the reverse is true. On February the 9th in the year 2000, protests were held on Ballhausplatz in Austria's capital Vienna, where the Federal Chancellery and the President's office are situated. These protests were directed against the formation of a coalition government by the conservative Austrian People Party and the far-right Austrian Freedom Party. Protesters erected an embassy of concerned citizens, first a tent, then a container, that was used as a center for the opposition to the unpopular government. This became the rallying point for the demonstrations taking place every Thursday. The unique movement claimed the right to have an address, at the beginning of March 2000 going so far as to allocate itself a house number, Ballhausplatz 1a, 1a, just between Ballhausplatz 1, that is the President's office, and Ballhausplatz 2, that is the office of Federal Chancellor. So this location, Ballhausplatz 1a, was given as a contact address also by Radio Reverberation, a program broadcast by the alternative Radio Orange. On the homepage there was the added comment, "Registered mail is guaranteed delivery." After being broken up in April 2002 and bringing the activity to an end voluntarily in September of the same year, the movement in fact saw a revival in June 2003. It started up at a new location, this time by the Danube Canal, and without an identifying house number. And later the container was sold. However, this story shows that having an address therefore doesn't just mean the possibility of being forced to join up or pay taxes. On occasion, it's something to be desired. Control and surveillance systems are more likely to be implemented if they can be used by those affected for their own purposes. So, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm also quite curious for your questions.
We have time for questions, so anyone?
Right. I couldn't help thinking through most of the early part of your talk when you made reference to critiques of the system from all sides. Mm-hmm. That you mentioned Benjamin mm-hmm. And his, I don't want to say nostalgic, but his backward glance mm-hmm. at imperial Paris in the 1860s. Mm-hmm. In the 60s, in the arcades project. And to me, and also to Benjamin, I think, one of the biggest features, most important features of that era was the fact that just as in Vienna a generation later, so in Paris, there was an overriding intelligence in the form of Haussmann, who decided to create basically a ring around the city and to intersect it with boulevards that would create very, very manageable quarters, particularly manageable in cases where they hadn't been before, where they were places of political and social contestation. And so the troops could be moved in easily, police and spies could be sent out. And also, the flip side of that for Benjamin was the fact that these magnificent panoramas and arcades were built, but they were built to divert from actual life in these different quarters. And that was the sense I had also with Otto Wagner, in Vienna, an attempt to control. And I know that in the book that Ruben, among other people, put together, The Political Life of Urban Streetscapes, one whole thing is the space of contestation in the names of streets. But what about also on this second level, beyond the numbering itself? Do you see the creation of segments, of neighborhoods, etc., as being part of this social control, or a part of this contested space beyond the numbering?
Well, the creation of neighborhoods, I would not say this, because neighborhoods, for example, in Paris, they existed already in the 18th century, and it was the police task or a need in the 18th century to get also control of by the police officers that were installed and by the informants. But of course, these neighborhoods were also kind of, well, let's say, points of resistance against the outside world concerning now Paris, especially in the 18th century. Because Alet Fage, she has worked a lot of this kind of what was happening in this everyday life in Paris in the Ancien Regime. But maybe the question, what concerns Walter Benjamin, on one side you really find in the Arcade project some of his, some mentioning of the house numbers, but also in one article, I think about Baudelaire. And there's this also this when he speaks about this cold number, and so when and he found this example of the workers of the suburb of Saint-Antoine who would prefer to give the house name instead of the street, the house number in. I think German book about workers' associations that was written maybe even in the 19th century. So I mean, the question concerning Benjamin is if this was only a nostalgic point of view to use this phrase of the cold number without heart or whatever. I mean, that is kind of a classical topos when you speak about numbers that we are cold and have no history. So maybe this is some part of an answer, not everything, but maybe it's possible to speak more about this later.
Maybe it's just a flash of light, but I'm wondering, is that yellow wire part of a bomb, and is it like a fuse about to go off when somebody's angry about it? Because it looks like it's like part of a stick of dynamite as if
No, I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe I don't even think that this is some kind of electricity supply. Maybe this is just a tie that is fixing something on this container. But as I know, there was never an explosion there.
I'm wondering, you talk brilliantly about the various things that happened in the 18th century in Europe in terms of street numbering. It seemed very varied. Is there any pattern in terms of street numbering is it associated with a modernizing regime as opposed to a more conservative one, or is it more random?
Well, I think that this short or this book title of James C. Scott, Seemed Like a State, where he also speaks about giving surnames to people and by regulating this. I think that this is a quite good description. So I would frame it within well, absolutism and also the creation of the modern state in the 18th century. And by this you can insert it in a kind of well, history of modernizing, or in a history of the beginning of a modern state. Although for me it's also important to stress that it's not only about this, because it needs also the other side that accepts this, or as I've said, appropriates this. And of course people could, who were affected by this new technique, they could use it for their own purposes, and this would be my argument why this house numbering still exists today. Perhaps, yes, why it was accepted.
You commented on the political and social status dimensions of house numbering, which is fascinating. I wondered if you and your research came across much in the way of a myth concerted over house numbering. If I, as an elite individual, could bribe or purchase a certain house number or influence the system.
I have not really understood the question of the last sentence, or?
Well, if I could be an exception to a system that was being proposed.
You mean
given
what?
my status and given sufficient funds, would I be able to, in some jurisdictions, be able to purchase my own house number? Be an exception to the rule. Could you do that ever?
Do you mean, I mean, what I know sometimes that people have problems with certain house numbers because they, so for example, the house number 13, and they try to get rid of it, or they have, because it would bring luck. And what I also know that, I mean, there's one case in a Moravian town in Brno, where a certain citizen had 3 house numbers on his house. And he tried to get rid at least of 2 of them. And it took him 10 years of correspondence with the authorities, so that in the end he succeeded, so that he had only 1 house number. But of course it's now not easy, or perhaps in Europe maybe even impossible to have no house number at all in some cases. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, one of the things that happens more recently on the work I've done on New York City is looking at what's called vanity addresses, kind of like vanity license plates, where you can, corporations in a city, if they're like contributing to the economy, they'll lobby the city to get, instead of having a numbered street, it might be plaza or place instead of street, or so there are those sorts of things that definitely do happen.
You were speaking a bit to the idea that in the States, or in the United States, that there's more kind of embracing of the house number, like wanting to keep your own personal house number and getting angry over changing that one. Do you think it's due to the idea that in Europe it seemed to be more of a rejected system, and in the States more of an embraced system?
Well, I think, of course, I mean, changing your house number, that's all, and maybe also your street name, as in our case, is also something considered as inconvenient. And I guess also that people whose house numbers would change in a certain street in Europe would not be happy about this. But I don't think that if this takes place, there would be that kind of resistance, because, well, it would be argued that it is necessary. And actually, this changing of house numbering took, if you consider this case of Vienna, where it was for every 25 years, so when new houses newly numbered. In that cases, I did not realize or did not read of resistance against this, because it was really necessary to introduce the new numbering, because how the numbers were confused.
Why do we have postal codes? And is that a form of modern addressing?
The postal codes, I mean, I know that, for example, in Austria, they were introduced just in the 1960s, so to indicate a certain village or town. But of course, this was not so much done, as I've said, for this authoritarian or let's say tax or military-driven purposes, but for the postal system. So to make this more easy, I would say that these postal codes were introduced out of this motivation, not to build state as it was done in the 18th century.
One last question. If you live in a fairly small town, and you're fairly well known for a particular thing, you might have a house number. But if the person who's sending you a letter doesn't even know your name and doesn't even know your house number, the reason I'm asking is because I know someone who received many, many letters, and he was doing work with honeybees, and it just said, they didn't know his name, the Bee Man, Middlebury, Vermont. And he got every single letter.
Yes,
because they knew him.
Yeah, in the German Empire around 1800, there was one address you could write perhaps only the name, and this was Goethe. To address him, so Goethe, Germany, or Weimar. So that was the perhaps a bit similar. But another case I want to mention, because I did not speak about door numbers. Because that is a specialty, I have to say, of Austria and especially Vienna. But not only the houses have numbers, but also the flats inside the houses. And the postal authorities, they really require that you insert the door number, and maybe you send a letter with giving the address also, or correct address, house number, but no door number. And even if maybe the postman would know where the person lives, because on the post box there's perhaps also written the name on it. Sometimes you would find a stamp on it that the address is not correct, because the door number is missing. So this can be also a misdirection, or even more the request of precision.
I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate. You mentioned that the World Bank was involved in street addressing in Africa, sub-Saharan African countries. I was wondering if you could elaborate on why the World Bank would be involved in that, and it's kind of rescaling, the certain actors that are involved from the kind of, either the national or local scale to these supranational actors. What is that related to, kind of the development strategy of the World Bank, or what's the logic behind that?
Well, of course, also building or establishing an addressing system that allows you, that makes everything easier for government authorities, of course, of like taxing people, perhaps also then introducing a cadastre. And so that was, I guess, the motivation behind this introduction of, well, house numbering system, which often also implies a street naming system, and you have to think which names to give to the streets. So this was then also, let's say, for perhaps a state building, I would say. I don't know if you also can add something to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, the World Bank deals a lot with, as you mentioned, like the so-called slum upgrading. Kind of by giving the numbers to buildings, it kind of brings it out of the informal sector into a formally recognized, legible space for the state, but also for other actors, economic actors that are coming in. And
yes, maybe this is also a kind of an important term, making something legible. But of course you have also to ask, making it legible for whom? Because the people who live inside, they know each other and they know where everybody is living, but it's making legible for authorities so that all their kind of duties also are to be fulfilled more easily.
Just quickly, it occurs to me during a lot of this discussion, once again with sites of contestation, and you know, way beyond the things that Foucault focused on. There come for many people, many residents and many visitors, a point of no return, a point of limit beyond which they subvert, you know, whether meaning to or unintentionally, the purposes of these addresses, like with the B-Man in Vermont, you know, or something like that, or else they subvert the CAPTCHA system, you know, being unwilling to go through that. And what I'm wondering is whether at some point there might not be a regression or a reversion on a mass scale to something before or outside the numbering system.
A reversion to a system where there are no legible numbers?
Or fewer, you know, or in other words, where it gets reserved for only, you know, officialdom or something like that.
I'm not sure if I think there's some case, is it in Mexico and Nicaragua, where there was a house numbering system, but then there was an earthquake. Yeah. And since then, this numbering system had no sense any longer, or it was not re-established. So that you maybe this would be worth to study as a kind of, let's say, regression. And so, then as an example for this.
Yeah.
The other case is a question of the point of no return concerning subversion. I'm not sure. So if it is not no longer possible to subvert the system, because what I also know is that sometimes you have this there's such a book by Gene Sharp who wanted to proposes groups of opposition what to do, and he also proposes to change the house numbers, so to fight against this legibility.
I think there was one case in Europe, I believe Czechoslovakia, when the Soviets invaded, and right before the invasion, all the urban residents stripped their house numbers off the houses to confuse the incoming army. Isn't that right?
Yes, this in 1968. This was the place, and you also find the stories also in other countries at other times of signposts being changed. Of course, you can also say, well, that it was not that much helpful, also, but it did not really reach the aim in the end. But of course, this happens. And now it would be the question what nowadays would be an equivalent possibility of resistance or subversion when you have everything on Google Maps.
One last question, I guess.
Okay. I was actually just thinking about the Google Maps aspect that you just mentioned. I was going to ask if you could think of any strategies of subversion around these newer technologies. I had in mind one example of the subversion, perhaps, of using those technologies in the sense that I had a rare friend who's very wealthy and was trying to find her house, and it was in a neighborhood I'd never been in before. It was apparently intentionally planned to be very disorienting and had no bus service anywhere near it, so I had to, but using Google Maps I was able to find it fairly easily. So perhaps there's the subversion of being given that legibility of landscape more democratically, but is there perhaps also the flip side of being able to obscure your location in a similar way that was intended by the planning of that potentially?
Well, this obscuring would be a kind of subversion if you manage. So another fascinating aspect is this kind of transparency that is like changing, let's say, modes of the rules for everyone. But of course, that doesn't mean that that power relations are inverted or social classes are being made more equally. But it changes the rules, and perhaps in this change there are new possibilities also for, let's say, resistance or subversion. But I mean, this is also true for this whole kind of history of surveillance. That surveillance on one hand affects well, those who might resist, but on the other hand, the other kind of a medal is the leaking of before secret documents, and so this would be the other side of this surveillance and the possibilities it gives to you.
All right, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Let's thank Anton one last time. Just a reminder, so the next City Talk will be on November 30th. Amelia Polonian, a political scientist from the University of Helsinki, will be coming to give a talk on the space of passions, populism, and the politics of us in the urban streetscapes of Europe. So I hope you all can join us for that. Have a good night, everyone.